Hey, how's it going, everyone? In this video, we're going to be doing some HTML and CSS. So we're going back to the basics of web development with these two awesome languages, and I'm going to be showing you how to build and style this search bar that you see right here. So this is a search bar that I actually just built, but I want to use it as a way to teach you about styling inputs, styling search bars, and then also working with icons, because those are all different things that we're going to be doing as we build this out. So the goal of this video is just to step through and really just learn how this thing is built. So I'm going to be building this in CodePen. So the website is codepen.io. If you've never been on CodePen before, it's an awesome website, and it's just a really good place to kind of like scaffold out and kind of build things in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript really quickly. It's also a cool environment because it will like update our code and we'll be able to see what we're building as we build it. So I think this is a really good environment to kind of learn in, just because there's a really tight feedback loop. Okay. So if we're going to build this search bar, I think the first thing we should do is try to break down exactly what's going on here in the thing that we want to build. So this search bar right here has a couple of different elements, a couple of different things to it. So first off, you can see it's just like this big orange rectangle, and then inside of it, we have basically two icons and then the actual search field itself. So we have this little magnifying glass icon, and then we have the area here where you can type, and you can see as I'm typing, it just kind of keeps scrolling over to the right. And then finally, we have this little X button. If you click on the button, maybe it would like clear out the text. Now keep in mind, I'm not going to be doing any JavaScript, so we're not going to be like, adding any functionality or wiring this up to anything. It's just going to be just the pure styles that I'm going to show you. But if it was me who was trying to build this, the first thing that I always like to do is just look at, once again, like what are the different aspects of this search bar that we're going to need to build out. So for me, I see four things. So the first is this container. It's this kind of like orange block. And then inside of the container, we have both of these icons and then the input itself. So I think that's probably a good place to start if we're going to be building this out. So why don't we just create each one of those individual things, and then we'll talk about how we can order them and style them together. So first and foremost, let's start with just the input itself. So we're going to create an input tag in HTML, and we can talk a little bit about how we might style that. So over here in the HTML, let's create that. So I'm going to create an input tag. Now, anytime that you're going to have any sort of an input tag in HTML, it's always through this. And then the way we determine what type of input it is through this type attribute. So I can say type, and I want this to be a text box, so we can do that. And then we can also have a placeholder attribute. Now the placeholder attribute, if we look on the finished product, is just search. So that's what we're going to put in here. And for those that don't know, the placeholder is just what's there when you haven't typed anything. So the second I start typing, the placeholder goes away. Once the text is cleared out, then it comes back. All right, so we have our little input over here. Now it's really, really small. It's really hard to see. So probably what we want to do is increase the font size. So I'm just going to create a little CSS rule over here. And when I use this asterisk character, that's called the wildcard character, it just means we're styling like everything in the entire document. So here, let's just up the font size to like 1.5 rems. And so if you don't have experience working with rems, I'm actually going to be using these a lot in this video. I think this is the best way to, a lot of people use pixels, but I think rems is the best way just because they scale really well. So an REM is basically one REM is like 1 unit of the document's font size. So if I say that the font size is now 1.5 REMs, that means it's going to be 1.5 times what the font size was initially. And by default, most browsers, the default font size is going to be 16 pixels. So if I have 1.5 REMs, that's going to be 16 plus 8 pixels. So we would have like 24 pixels. So that's would be 1.5 REMs. All right, so that's just a little bit about REMs, about how I'm going to be using them. So we have our input. That's looking pretty good. Now, obviously, we're going to need to add some styles onto this later. But once again, for now, I just want to get sort of the base elements done here. So the next thing then is we need to add in these icons, right? So I have this little X icon. I have this search icon. And when we're using icons in HTML and CSS, it's actually very common. And generally when you're working with icons, you want to work with icons that are in an SVG format. So SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and it's actually natively supported by HTML. So if you've ever seen like an SVG file, it looks a lot like HTML. It's this like XML like syntax. But you can use those on web pages, and they're really good because they can scale. So these SVGs could scale to like as big as you want them or as little as you want them, just like normal text would. Now there's a bunch of different ways that we could get some of these SVGs and get some of these icons, but this problem has already been solved. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to use something called Font Awesome. So the website is fontawesome.com. This is really cool to check out. And if you come over here to the icons section on the website, there's just like this huge, massive collection of icons. A lot of them are free, which we can use on our site. So you can search here, and actually if we just type in search, so there's this search icon that we want to use, and then I think there's also one called times, yeah. So this times icon, those are the ones that we're going to want to use, and basically the ones that I'm using over here. So then the question becomes, okay, now we know where we want to get our icons from, so how do we get them into our HTML and CSS? Well, we can do that by basically importing or including Font Awesome's CSS file. So Font Awesome has this like CSS file that we can include on our website, and it'll give us access to all of these icons. And generally that's like a pretty good way to do that. So there is a link, and I'm just on this like CDN.js site. I'll put this link in the description so you guys have it, but this is the link that we're going to want to use. So this is essentially like if I was to paste this into my browser, you'll see here it's like this massive CSS file, and this has all of those SVGs like contained in it. So this has all the icons that we need. So what we want to do is just import this into our website, and then we can start using the icons. So once again, this link will be in the description. I'm just going to copy it here. And what we want to do then is put this in the head of our document. Now, if you're using CodePen just like me, you can go into your settings and then go over here to HTML. And it says here stuff for the head of the document. So this is where we want to put this like link tag to this. So you're going to make less than sign, and this is just going to be a link tag. You're going to say rel is equal to style sheet, and then you're going to say href, and in here you want to paste that link. Now this got all weird when I pasted it, but you're going to do that, and then you're just going to close this off like that. So this is our link tag. And if you're in CodePen, just put this in the stuff for head. Otherwise, just put this in the head of your HTML document, wherever it is that you're working from. Okay, so we're going to save and close. And so now this technically should be loaded in. And if it is loaded in correctly, we're going to be able to use those icons. So let me show you how we can do that. First things first, let's create a div. And in here, I'm going to give this a class. And all we have to do to use these icons from Font Awesome is just say FA as the class, space, and then FA dash, and then the name of the icon that you want to use. So in our case, we are going to use the search icon as we just saw, and you'll see that that's popping up right over there. So once again, this is the same exact search icon over here on this Font Awesome website. And then we'll do the same thing for the times one. So down here, we can say FA, and then this is going to be times. So we have the search, we also have the times, and that's basically it, right? So over here, these are the three main parts of this input aside from just like this big container. And so now what we need to do is we need to order them correctly. And a lot of times when people are beginning with CSS, this is something that's like very confusing about how to do this, like how to lay these things out so that they are right next to each other and so that they kind of can scale with the different screen sizes. So I'm going to walk you through what I consider to be the best way to do this, and that's using something called Flexbox. So if you've done any CSS before, I'm sure you've heard about Flexbox. Flexbox is probably the best way that you can lay things out on either a horizontal or a vertical axis in CSS, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So in this case, we want to lay all of these out on like a horizontal or like an x-axis. So this is a perfect situation to use Flexbox. Okay, so let's walk through exactly how to do this. Now, first off, I want to order these correctly. So we're going to put the search over here on top of the input. Right, so it'll go the search, the input, and then FA times. Now, you'll notice that these are already kind of lined up next to each other horizontally. But this isn't necessarily the best way to do this, because as you'll see, as I start resizing this, like they start wrapping around, and that's not necessarily what we want, right? This search bar over here, if I was to resize it, you'll see that it's not sort of wrapping around, it's just kind of staying where it is. So what we want to do is use Flexbox in order to sort of put these things next to each other, and then this will be like a better way to do that. So in order to do Flexbox with this, we're going to want to create a wrapper. And anytime that you're doing things with Flex, it's always a good idea to have like a wrapper like this. So I'm going to take all of these and I'm going to put them inside of this div. So we have this sort of wrapper div that's like wrapping around all of these other elements. And this we are going to give a class, and the class is going to be called input wrapper. So let's just call this input wrapper. And then down here in our CSS, we're going to want to start styling that. So in order to style this, we can access it using the class name. So I can say dot and then input wrapper. And what we're going to do, like I said, is we're going to use Flexbox. So Flexbox and the flex display type, which is what we're going to use, this is something that's going to go on this wrapper div, and it's going to affect all of the elements that are inside of that wrapper div. Okay, so we have this wrapper. This is going to have display flex, and we can put that down here. So I'll say display flex. And what this means is that all of the elements that are inside this wrapper are going to obey the rules of the flex display. And by default, that means that they're all going to be lined up on the x-axis horizontally. Okay? So, and as you can see, that's exactly what's happening now. And if I was to resize this, it kind of stays, at the same. It doesn't like wrap around, right? So we've kind of fixed that problem. Now, another thing that you'll notice here is if we scroll in, you'll notice that these aren't exactly aligned correctly. So like the search bar is taking up more space than this magnifying glass or this X. What I would like to do is have them all be just aligned on that sort of vertical axis, right? So I want all of these to be kind of down in the middle, whereas they're more up at the top here. And there's an attribute that we can use with Flex, which is called align items, and we're going to say center. Now check this out. When I do align item center, you'll see that the magnifying glass and the X actually move down a little bit. So now they're all sort of on that same axis, on that same plane, and they're all lined up a little bit better, okay? Another thing that we might want to do though is you'll see that these are all right next to each other. So the magnifying glass is right next to the input, and this is over here right next to that X. So we could give the input a little bit of a margin, and that'll fix that. So let's come down here and we are going to style the input. So I'm just going to say input, and the input is going to have some padding, or no, sorry, we're going to give it some margin. And we only want it to have margin on the left and on the right sides. So there's a couple different ways we could do this. The first thing you could do is you could say like margin left, and then you could give this a value, and then you could say margin right, and then you could give this a value as well. So maybe we could give these a value of like, I don't know, 0.5 REMs and 0.5 REMs. So now this is like a little bit more spaced out. And so if you're not super comfortable with margins, basically the margin, and I can just inspect this element here, the margin is just like space that's around the search box. So if you can see here, like this orange area, that's the margin. It's like outside of the search. That's sort of pushing the elements that are next to it away, which gives us some space. And that is going to be different from something called padding, which is actually space that goes inside of the element, or like inside of the border of the element. So margin is definitely the right thing for us to use there. That'll push some of that stuff away. But I will show you another way that we can do this as well. So you could say margin left and margin right, but what might be easier would just be to say margin, and then we can actually define the top, right, bottom, and left margins all at the same time. So if you say margin like this, you can give it 4 numbers. So like 0, 0, 0, 0, something like that. And let me show you what these do. So each one of these 4 numbers represents the margin on a particular side of the search bar. So the first one here, this is going to be for the top. Okay, and then we're going to go down to the right. So in my case, I want this to be 0.5 REMs. So this is going to be on the right, and you can see there that we got the margin showing up. This one's going to be for the bottom, that third one, which again, we want that to stay 0. And then over here on the left, which is the last one, we could say 0.5 REMs. And so it's basically doing the same thing. So you can say margin left, margin right explicitly, or you could do it this way. There's really no big difference. But I think I prefer this way just because it's a lot more concise. Okay, so we've lined all of these up on the correct axis, and they're all lined to the center, right? And we did that with this display flex and this align item center. Another thing that we want to do though is we want to lay this out so that it takes up the full width of the browser. That's just something that I'm personally going to do, and I want to show you how that works. So actually by default, if we inspect this, and I'm just going to inspect this real quick. So you can see here, if I inspect this input wrapper, because it's a div, it's a block level element, which means it's going to take up the entire width of the screen. And whenever I build search bars, I like to do what I'm about to show you because it just makes them a lot more resizable and reusable. So let me show you real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say justify content, and we're going to say space between. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it so this search bar takes up the entire width of its container. Now, in this case, the search bar is just in the body of our document, so it's doing all of that. But this means that it's sort of taking up that full width, and it's just a lot easier to work with it this way. And then the last thing that we want to do, as you can see, like there's still all these gaps here. So what we'll do is we'll say the input is going to have a width of 100%. And to me right now, this represents what I would consider the best way to lay something like this out. So you'll see here now, the search bar is completely responsive. And that means that I can make this as big as I want and the search bar will take up the entire spot, or I can make this as small as I want and it'll shrink to that spot. And it's because we did all of this stuff with the flex and then also making the input width 100% that's able to work. Okay, now here's the thing. You might not want the search bar to like take up the entire width of this browser window, and that's fine. So if you want, you can change the size of the input wrapper. So we could say here, okay, the width of the input wrapper is going to be like, I don't know, 200 pixels, something like that. And, or, we can make it maybe like 500 pixels. It doesn't really matter, but whatever we want to make it. So now the search bar is like its own size, but you'll see it's not as responsive anymore. That's just because we gave it this width. Okay, but I think this is good for now. And so we have everything lined up. We imported all of those icons and we have our search thing here. But you'll notice that this actually looks a lot different. So the finished product over here, it almost looks like all of the icons and the input field itself are contained in this same little wrapper, right? So like they sort of have this color, and that's sort of the next thing that we want to start doing. And the first step towards that is we want to remove some of the styling from this input. So you'll notice this input, like when I click on it, we get this blue outline, and it's, even if there's no outline, we still have this border here that you can see. So we want to kind of remove all of that because we're going to create the illusion that this is just one big container and that the input is just kind of embedded in it. So in order to remove some of these, and this is like, we're getting down to the styling inputs here. So the first thing we'll do is remove the border. So I'm going to come down here to my input thing, and I'm just going to say border, and we're just going to say none. And that's going to completely get rid of the border. And we still have the placeholder here, so I can still tell where I need to type in. So it's still, fairly accessible. It's just that we don't have that ugly border. But what you will notice is that when I focus in on this thing, that we still get this like little blue border that's showing up. So if you want to get rid of that, you can just say outline, and that's also going to be none. And so now when I click on this, we don't have any border that's showing up, and I can just type in like that. Now, once again, the reason that this is sort of contained is because over here we're giving this a width. So I'm saying that the input wrapper has a width of 500 pixels. If I got rid of that, now the search bar will take up the entire area that it's given, okay? But I just have this width here just so it's, I guess, just like a little bit easier to see. Cool. So we've styled the search bar and we've gotten rid of some of those outlines, some of those things that we didn't want. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to create this little outline here. So this little orange outline right there. And that's all going to have to do with the input wrapper up here. So what we want to do is give the input wrapper a background color. Now I have a color that I already picked out for this. But you can really pick whatever color you want, right? This is kind of like your thing. So the color that I have, it's a hex color. So it's E26D5C. It's like this random hex color. But this is that orange color that you'll see. Now you'll notice that when I add the background color onto this, it only colors in where these icons are. So where the search is right here, it doesn't color that in. And that's because the search is going to have a white background explicitly defined on it by default. So what we want to do is we want to grab this same background and we want to put it down here on the input. And so now all of these things have that orange background and it's sort of like this seamless thing. Another thing that you'll notice on this one though is that there's this nice little sort of padding that's around all of these elements. So that's what we're going to do. We're also going to add in some padding. So I'm going to add in maybe 0.5 REMs of padding. Now remember we talked about REMs. So these REMs are like a relative unit of measurement and it's all based on the font size of the document. So 0.5 REMs in this case, our font size is 1.5 REMs. So this will be like 0.5 of whatever the base font size is, okay? And you don't have to use these REMs, but I think it's kind of like a nice way to do things because it'll scale really well if you change the font size of the document. Okay, so now we have our search bar. It has this nice padding, but you'll notice on this one that we have this rounded border. So how do we add that rounded border? We can use something called border radius. And I'm just gonna put it like that. And once again, why don't we give this 0.5 REMs? And we'll see how that looks. Now you can play around with this. You can make this as rounded or as not rounded as you want. I kind of like that nice little rounded look. I think it's nice. So we have the border radius. We have everything colored. The next thing we want to do though is change the font color. So you can see that all of these are like black. And the way that we can do that is just by saying color down here and we'll just make it white. Now once again, you'll see that this didn't apply to the search bar. And that means that we're just going to have to come down here and add the color white, just like we added the background as well. And so now the text color here is going to be white. Another thing that you'll notice is the placeholder on this one is not this gray color. And there's actually a way that you can change the placeholder color in CSS. So you can select it using what's called a pseudo class. So it's these two colons right here, and then you can say placeholder, and this will change the placeholder color. So you could change it down here. So for example, we could change it to like black, and that should change the placeholder color. I actually have a color picked out that was from over here. This is actually this like placeholder color. It's like a little bit lighter than this background color, and it's also that same color that we're using for the shadow down here. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in, but remember, you can use any color you want. It doesn't really matter. So this is going to be, for me, it's going to be F0B 2A8. Yeah, I just have that like written down on the side there. And so there we go. We have our nice placeholder. It's this nice little, I guess, like peach looking color, and the text is all white. And this is actually starting to come together. It's starting to look a lot like this guy that we have over here. The last big thing though is this shadow. So you can see here that we have this little funky shadow that's kind of like hanging down off of the element there. And I'll show you guys how we can do that. So that's also going to be something that we're going to put here on the input wrapper, and we're going to use the box shadow property. One of the most misunderstood properties in CSS. This is, I think a lot of times for beginners, box shadow can be a little bit intimidating. And it's that way because it takes a number of different sort of measurements, okay? So over here, we are going to add in 3 numbers and a color. So I'm just going to do this real quick, and I'm going to say 0 REMs, 0 REMs, 0 REMs, and then we're also going to put this same color. And I'll explain exactly what's going on here but then I'm going to put this background color. So the box shadow property takes these 4 attributes, okay? This one over here, this first number, so let me show you. I'm going to put 0.5 for this just so we can see it. And actually, I need to change the color needs to be this, the one that was down here. Okay, so if I put this first one at 0.5 REMs, you'll see that it starts shooting out to the right there. So this number right here is how far you want the shadow to go to the right. So I could say 0.5 REMs. I could also say negative 0.5 REMs, and you'll see here that it's going over to the left side. So this first one is the x-axis. It's what's going to the left or right. I'm sure you can guess what the second one is. It's going to be vertically. So here I could say 0.5 REMs, and now it's going to go down that 0.5 REMs vertically. So we have this sort of situated like that, and we could change this. Maybe it should be 2.5. I forget what I did on the other one, but yeah, this looks pretty good. And then this third one over here, this is what we call the blur. And the blur is basically how kind of blurred out this is. So when we have 0, you can see that it's just like this solid block. But if I was to increase this to like 1 REM, now you'll see that it's kind of like this misty shadow thing. It's really gradient, and we can do like 0.5 just to see this as well. So depending on this number, it's going to be more and more kind of gradient or blurred out down there. And different design styles would have you do different things there. But for our search bar, this looks like exactly what we wanted. Okay, so that was really like the last big piece to this whole thing. Now, once again, we could change the width if we wanted. So here I just have this width as like 500 pixels. Once again, if I got rid of that, now it's just this sort of full screen search bar. And you'll see as I type through, it's this nice little typing animation, and all of these like icons are still showing up there. So this really is like, if I was building this search bar in like a production code base, this is exactly how I would build it. So I would utilize things like Flexbox. I would also utilize things like box shadows, margins, padding, all of these different things in order to get this kind of created. But otherwise, I think that's about it. So that is our search bar. I just want to say thank you so much for watching. All this code will be available on CodePen, so please come take a look, fork it, make your own, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.